The opening salvo in what many had dismissed as mere campaign rhetoric has detonated with the force of a depth charge, sending shockwaves through the corridors of global power and leaving the White House scrambling to contain a political and economic firestorm of its own making. For the past 10 months, the administration's aggressive tariff strategy, framed as a necessary shock to rebalance a rigged global system, has been a source of intense debate. But the breaking point has arrived not from a foreign capital, but from a cascade of events that now exposes a strategy many allies and analysts believe is not just failing, but actively backfiring, fracturing alliances, and leaving American trade policy dangerously isolated on the world stage. The sheer speed of the unraveling has caught even seasoned diplomats off guard, transforming what was once a calculated negotiation tactic into a full-blown international crisis with no clear exit strategy in sight. What began as a tool to extract concessions has, according to insiders within the State Department and trade delegations, morphed into a source of profound diplomatic chaos. The administration's approach, implemented through a series of executive orders and emergency declarations, was designed to be swift and unilateral, bypassing traditional congressional oversight that might have tempered its more extreme provisions. However, the aftermath has been a maelstrom of unintended consequences, with the latest flashpoint being a minor diplomatic correction over a trade document with India that inadvertently revealed a major chasm in trust and communication between two of the world's largest democracies. This incident, dismissed by the White House press corps as a bureaucratic hiccup, was in fact a window into a deeper dysfunction where the pressure to project strength has consistently overridden the quiet work of diplomatic maintenance. To understand the depth of the current crisis, one must look back at the post-war economic architecture that the current White House strategy is systematically dismantling. For decades, the bedrock of global prosperity was a rules-based order, overseen by institutions like the World Trade Organization, where disputes were adjudicated and tariffs were negotiated downward in a multilateral framework. This system, while imperfect and often criticized for its slow pace, provided predictability, the lifeblood of international commerce and investment. The current administration, however, views this system not as a public good, but as a series of handcuffs that limited American sovereignty and allowed rivals and allies to take advantage of American markets while pursuing their own industrial policies. This philosophical divide between multilateralism and unilateralism lies at the heart of every confrontation now playing out across the globe. The intellectual architects of this new approach, many of them schooled in the theories of economic nationalism, argue that the old system was never truly fair. They point to decades of manufacturing job losses and persistent trade deficits as evidence that free trade agreements enriched corporate shareholders while devastating working-class communities in the American heartland. Their argument, delivered with populist fervor, resonates with an electorate that has grown skeptical of globalization's promises. But critics within the economic establishment counter that the cure is now proving worse than the disease. By attacking the system's institutions rather than reforming them from within, they argue, the administration has thrown out the baby with the bathwater, sacrificing the very mechanisms that could have been used to address legitimate grievances in a more constructive manner. The year 2025, in retrospect, was the critical inflection point for this trade experiment. The imposition of sweeping tariffs covering hundreds of billions of dollars in imported goods was initially met with a predictable surge in trade activity as companies rushed to beat the deadlines, creating an illusion of economic vitality that fooled many observers. Ports from Los Angeles to Savannah reported record volumes as importers stockpiled inventory, temporarily boosting employment in logistics and warehousing sectors across the country. The WTO noted that this front-loading temporarily inflated trade figures, masking the underlying fragility of the economy beneath a veneer of activity that could not possibly be sustained. But by the fourth quarter of 2025, the hangover set in with a vengeance, as warehouses filled to capacity and ordering slowed dramatically. The artificial stimulus faded quickly. Warehouses reached maximum capacity, and the reality of sharply slowing growth projections for 2026 began to dawn on economists, signaling a sharp cooldown that the protectionist measures were supposedly designed to prevent. The temporary boost from pre-tariff stockpiling had distorted trade data and masked the fundamental weaknesses in the global trading system. As these temporary factors dissipated, the underlying structural damage caused by the trade war became increasingly apparent to analysts and policymakers alike. The pre-importing phenomenon had essentially borrowed future demand to prop up current statistics, creating a statistical mirage that would inevitably lead to disappointing numbers once the inventory adjustment period concluded. The political theater surrounding these policies reached a fever pitch in late January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, that annual gathering of the global elite. The Swiss Alpine town, usually a bastion of elite consensus where business leaders and politicians gather to network in carefully choreographed harmony, became an arena of open confrontation between the United States and its traditional allies. French President Emmanuel Macron did not mince words, labeling the tariff threats against Europe as fundamentally unacceptable and brandishing the EU's newly fortified anti-coercion instruments as necessary deterrents against what he described as economic blackmail. It was a moment that crystallized the new reality. The United States was no longer seen as the leader of the free world, but as a primary disruptor of the global economy. Behind the scenes in Washington, the situation is even more volatile than the public realizes from carefully curated press briefings. A recent analysis published by a scholar with ties to King's College London detailed a telling episode involving the India trade deal that has since become a case study in diplomatic mismanagement and its consequences. The White House initially released a fact sheet claiming New Delhi had committed to purchasing over $500 billion in American energy and defense equipment, a massive figure that would represent a historic shift in bilateral trade relations. Within hours after frantic calls from Indian officials fearing a domestic political revolt from farmers and opposition parties accusing the government of selling out national interests, the language was quietly softened to intends on the official website. This was not a clerical error or a simple proofreading oversight. It was a stark admission that the administration's public-facing narrative had dangerously overstepped the bounds of diplomatic reality, forcing a humiliating retreat that Indian media gleefully covered for weeks. The episode revealed the profound disconnect between the White House's desire to project strength and the actual negotiated outcomes achieved through patient diplomacy. It also demonstrated how domestic political considerations in both countries can collide in unexpected ways, turning routine diplomatic communications into political liabilities that undermine trust between allies and create lasting resentments that complicate future negotiations. This friction is not isolated to India, but reflects a broader pattern in America's approach to its traditional partners. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, positioning himself as a leader of the so-called middle powers seeking to bridge divides between major economies, returned from delicate trade talks with China, only to be threatened with 100% tariffs by the White House on Canadian aluminum and dairy products. The message was unmistakably clear: any outreach to Beijing, even from America's closest neighbor and largest trading partner, is now treated as a betrayal requiring punitive response regardless of the consequences. This zero-sum logic, however, is pushing allies away rather than bringing them into line with American priorities. Carney's subsequent warning to Parliament that when the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself, has become a rallying cry for nations seeking to de-risk from an unpredictable United States, accelerating the very diversification Washington claims to want to prevent. The Canadian leader's words resonated far beyond Ottawa, striking a chord in capitals across Europe and Asia, where similar concerns about American reliability have been growing for years. This sentiment represents a fundamental shift in the psychology of alliance management, transforming the United States from a reliable partner into a source of uncertainty that must be hedged against through diversification and strategic autonomy. The internal White House strategy, once hailed by its architects as a masterstroke of leverage that would bring trading partners to the negotiating table, is now being dissected for its fundamental flaws by economists and political scientists across the ideological spectrum. A principal architect of the tariff regime, now serving in a senior role at the Federal Reserve, continues to insist publicly that the costs are very when-he and are primarily borne by foreign exporters who must lower prices to maintain market access. But this assertion is flatly contradicted by the administration's own actions, such as the recent consideration of tariff exemptions for tech giants and automotive manufacturers, a move that implicitly admits the policy is hurting the very industries it was meant to protect. Furthermore, the strategy has failed its core mission spectacularly. Manufacturing jobs have not returned in any meaningful numbers, with employment figures in 2025 actually dipping below 2023 levels despite the tariff protections. The promised renaissance of American industry has failed to materialize, as companies have responded to uncertainty by investing in automation rather than hiring, and by shifting supply chains to other countries rather than bringing production home. The gap between American consumption and domestic production remains vast, with consumers spending $5.5 trillion on goods, while domestic output reached only $2.8 trillion. A shortfall that must inevitably be filled by imports regardless of tariff barriers. Globally, the reaction to American policy has been a tectonic shift in trade patterns that will take years to fully map and understand. The era of hyper-globalization, where supply chains snaked across the planet in pursuit of the lowest cost and greatest efficiency, is officially over according to multiple analyses. According to economists tracking these developments, we have entered an age of lasting volatility where geopolitics trumps economics and supply chain resilience is valued over marginal cost savings. Companies are no longer just diversifying for profit. They are actively nearshoring production to neighboring countries and friendshoring to politically aligned nations to insulate themselves from the risk of sudden tariff impositions or export controls that could destroy their business models overnight. This fundamental reconfiguration is creating new manufacturing hubs in places like Vietnam, Mexico, and Poland, while critically marginalizing those who cannot adapt quickly enough to the new landscape. The winners and losers in this new environment are being determined not by traditional comparative advantage, but by political alignment and the ability to navigate an increasingly complex regulatory environment. UNCTAD analysis shows that these shifts are redistributing competitiveness in complex and uneven ways, with some exporters gaining advantages while others lose ground, fundamentally reshaping trade flows and sourcing decisions that were previously stable for decades. The uncertainty itself has become a barrier to trade, often more damaging than the tariffs themselves. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of American protectionism is the quiet but steady surge in South-South trade that has been accelerating for years but is now reaching critical mass as nations seek alternatives to U.S.-centered supply chains. For decades, developing nations looked to the West, particularly the United States and European Union, as their primary export market and source of investment capital. That dependency is now dissolving with remarkable speed as new trade routes open between emerging economies. This massive economic bloc, representing billions of consumers and some of the world's fastest-growing economies, is building its own financial architecture, payment systems, and supply chains, effectively bypassing a U.S.-centric system. The European Union, stung by the tariff threats and the inflammatory rhetoric surrounding potential American acquisition of Greenland, is accelerating its own independent trade agenda with remarkable speed and purpose. Having finally concluded a quarter-century of difficult negotiations with the South American Mercosur bloc, Brussels is now actively finalizing comprehensive trade deals with India, Mexico, Indonesia, and several African nations. The message is unmistakable. While the United States erects walls and retreats behind protectionist barriers, the rest of the world is building bridges and expanding commercial relationships at an unprecedented pace. This is not just about economics. It represents a profound geopolitical realignment. Inside the Beltway, the political heat on the White House is intensifying to levels that threaten the administration's legislative agenda and re-election prospects. A recent poll published by Reason magazine in collaboration with major survey research firms indicates that 59% of Americans now oppose the administration's economic policies, with a clear majority believing the tariffs are damaging the U.S. economy rather than protecting American workers. This domestic backlash is providing ammunition to critics on Capitol Hill from both parties, who are beginning to question the legal foundations of tariffs imposed without congressional consent. Senate hearings on the matter have grown increasingly contentious, with administration officials struggling to defend policies that even some Republican allies privately acknowledge are doing more harm than good in their home districts. The legal challenge looming over the White House is perhaps the most existential threat to its entire trade agenda, potentially invalidating years of work with a single court ruling. With the Supreme Court now preparing to scrutinize the use of emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional authorization, Legal scholars suggest the conservative-leaning court may ultimately balk at this executive overreach. The justices, including those appointed by Republican presidents, are acutely aware that tariff setting is a power constitutionally vested in Congress under Article 1, and that previous administrations of both parties have respected this separation of powers even when pushing the boundaries of trade authority. By bypassing Congress entirely and relying on emergency declarations, the administration has destabilized the delicate balance of power within the U.S. government. The human cost of these policies is only beginning to be understood, beyond the macroeconomic statistics and trade flow data that dominate headlines. In the American Midwest, farmers who were promised that tariffs would open new markets for their crops are instead watching their exports wither as trading partners retaliate with their own tariffs on agricultural products. In manufacturing communities, workers who were told that factories would return are instead seeing automation accelerate as companies invest in technology rather than new hires, uncertain whether any trade regime will last long enough to justify expanding payrolls. And in communities along the border with Mexico and Canada, families and businesses that have built their lives around cross-border integration for generations are watching helplessly as their world is dismantled. As the USMCA trade deal with Mexico and Canada approaches its mandatory review period, the stakes could not be higher for the integrated North American economy that has developed over 3 decades. Administration officials have hinted in background briefings that the agreement could be allowed to lapse entirely, potentially replaced by a patchwork of bilateral deals that would dismantle the carefully constructed framework that has governed trade on the continent. Such a move would be catastrophic for deeply integrated supply chains in automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and countless other sectors, proving that the America First doctrine, when pushed to its extreme, ultimately leaves America alone and weakened. Canadian and Mexican officials are already preparing contingency plans, diversifying their trade relationships, and reducing their dependence on the U.S. market. The fractures in the Western alliance are now visible to the entire world, not just to diplomatic insiders who follow these matters closely through classified cables. When British Prime Minister Keir Starmer visited Beijing to sign trade deals aimed at positioning post-Brexit Britain in the global economy, the White House's reaction was a confusing mix of punitive threats against Canada and political warnings to London about the dangers of engaging with China. This inconsistency reveals a strategy that cannot distinguish between a strategic competitor like China and a historical ally like Britain or Canada, treating every nation as either a threat to be countered or a mark to be exploited. The result is that every nation, even America's closest friends, is now forced to hedge its bets. What then does the future hold for the global trading system and America's place within it? The most likely scenario, according to a consensus of economists and political scientists interviewed for this investigation, is a continued fragmentation of the global economy into competing regional blocs with different rules, standards, and currencies. The Global Trade Organization concept, proposed by former IMF chief economist Ann Kruger as an alternative to the paralyzed WTO, seems less like an academic thought experiment and more like a practical necessity with each passing month. If the United States continues to block WTO dispute settlement appointments and ignore its rulings, the remaining 60% of global trade represented by other nations may simply form their own body with its own rules and enforcement mechanisms. The risk of a full-blown trade war with China remains the sword of Damocles hanging over the entire global economy, threatening to sever the remaining threads of commercial interdependence that have kept peace between the two superpowers for decades. With the Phase 1 trade deal between the United States and China set to expire in late 2026, the next few months will be absolutely critical for determining the trajectory of bilateral relations for years to come. If negotiations fail to produce a new framework, the resulting escalation could trigger a cascade of corporate insolvencies, particularly in export-reliant sectors like agriculture, aerospace, and technology, dwarfing the disruptions seen so far. The temporary protection that tariffs offered to certain domestic industries in 2025 will wear off as global supply chains reconfigure. In the financial markets, investors are beginning to price in a future of permanent trade conflict and economic fragmentation with potentially severe consequences. Currency markets have grown increasingly volatile as nations explore alternatives to the dollar-dominated system that has underpinned global finance since Bretton Woods. Stock markets react violently to every tariff announcement and diplomatic slight, with volatility indices spiking on even minor trade-related news. And bond markets are signaling concerns about long-term growth prospects that no amount of short-term stimulus can address. The cost of capital for companies caught in the crossfire of trade disputes is rising, and the premium for certainty has never been higher in modern financial history. The environmental dimension of this trade conflict has received far less attention than it deserves, given the climate emergency facing the planet and the urgent need for international cooperation. As nations erect trade barriers and retreat into protectionism, the cooperation needed to address global challenges like climate change becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Green technologies, from solar panels to electric vehicle batteries, depend on complex global supply chains that are now being disrupted by the very policies that claim to promote energy independence. And the carbon footprint of reconfiguring supply chains, building new factories, and shipping goods longer distances along less efficient routes is adding millions of tons of emissions to the atmosphere at precisely the moment when every ton counts. In the closing days of this investigation, a senior European trade negotiator with decades of experience in transatlantic relations offered a sobering reflection on what has been lost. Speaking on condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of ongoing negotiations, he noted that the genius of the post-war order was that it turned historical adversaries into indispensable partners through shared economic destiny. The European coal and steel community, which evolved into the European Union, was explicitly designed to make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible by intertwining their economies so deeply that conflict would destroy both. The current American strategy, by weaponizing that very interdependence and treating economic integration as a vulnerability rather than a strength, is doing the opposite, turning partners into adversaries and making conflict more thinkable. The White House sees tariffs as a tool to win a game, to extract concessions, to demonstrate strength to domestic audiences hungry for signs that someone is fighting for them. But the rest of the world is no longer sure they want to play by those rules, and some are quietly leaving the table to build a new one of their own, where cooperation and mutual benefit are still valued. The question that remains unanswered as this investigation concludes is whether American leaders will recognize what is happening before it is too late, before the institutions and relationships painstakingly built over generations have been irreparably damaged, before the economic order that underpinned American prosperity has been permanently dismantled, before the world that America made has been replaced by one in which America is just another power, respected but not followed, feared but not loved, strong but dangerously alone.